Unfortunately, the pandemic has slightly slewed things, in as much as it's hard to spend as much time with the Queen than we would like to. We've been trying to, but of course it's still not that easy.
There is a room inside a royal palace where decisions are made that never make the headlines. Decisions about bloodlines, duty, and the futures of children who never asked to be born into a dynasty. And inside that room, on a day that palace insiders say no one saw coming, one of the Crown's most loyal and quietly devoted members stood up, pushed back her chair, and walked out. Not in tears, not in a rage, but with the kind of quiet, steely resolve that tells you this woman has made up her mind and nothing in the world is going to change it. That woman was Sophie, the Duchess of Edinburgh. And the decision that drove her to that breaking point was about her children. Sophie Helen Rhys-Jones was born on January 20th, 1965 in Kent, England. Her background was as far from royal as you can get. Her mother Mary was a secretary and charity volunteer. Her father Christopher was a sales director. There were no titles, no servants, no sprawling estates, no silver spoons. She trained as a secretary at West Kent College and then built a career entirely on her own terms in public relations, one of the most competitive industries in the United Kingdom. She worked at Capital Radio, represented firms across the UK, Switzerland, and Australia, and in 1996 launched her own PR agency. This was a woman who understood boardrooms, deadlines, clients, and the relentless pressure of having to earn your place every single day. When Sophie met Prince Edward, first crossing paths through work in 1987 and then beginning a relationship in 1993, she wasn't a wide-eyed girl dazzled by the prospect of a crown. She was a successful professional woman with her own income, her own clients, and her own identity. Their engagement was announced in January 1999, and they married at St. George's Chapel, Windsor Castle, on June 19th of that same year. But Sophie never forgot where she came from, not for a single day. She remembered what it felt like to commute, to worry about bills, to negotiate a contract, to be anonymous on a Tuesday morning. And when she became a mother, that memory transformed into something fierce, something protective, something that would eventually bring her into direct conflict with one of the most powerful institutions on earth. She wanted her children to be people first, royals second, if at all. When their first child, Lady Louise, was born on November 8, 2003, the birth itself was terrifying. Sophie suffered a sudden placental abruption, a life-threatening emergency that strikes without warning and can kill both mother and child within minutes. Edward was not even in the country at the time. He rushed back from Mauritius. Louise was delivered prematurely by emergency C-section, weighing just 4 pounds and 9 ounces. Both mother and daughter nearly died that day. Sophie, having faced death in the most intimate and visceral way a mother can, emerged from that experience with a clarity of purpose that most of us will never know. When their son James was born on December 17, 2007, also by C-section, Sophie and Edward made a decision that genuinely astonished the royal world. They chose not to give their children the royal titles they were legally entitled to. Under letters patent issued by King George V in 1917, both Louise and James were eligible to be styled as Her Royal Highness Princess Louise and His Royal Highness Prince James. The palace confirmed instead that the children would be recognized as the children of an Earl, Lady Louise Windsor and Viscount Severn. In a world where royal titles are currency, where they open doors, command instant respect, and guarantee a life of privilege, Sophie and Edward voluntarily walked away from all of it for their children. Sophie explained it herself in a candid interview with the Sunday Times in 2020. She said the decision was made so their children would understand they would likely need to work for a living. She acknowledged that once Louise and James turned 18, they would have the option to claim their titles, but she made clear she thought it highly unlikely they would choose to do so, and she was right. Ask yourself this: in a family where status is everything, where position, rank, and precedence define your entire existence, what kind of woman makes that choice? What kind of love drives a mother to voluntarily hand back a title that most people in this country would give anything to have? The answer is a woman who has seen the other side of the palace walls, a woman who knows exactly what a title costs. Because while the world envies the tiara and the gilded carriage, Sophie had lived inside the machine. She knew what the institution demanded and what it took away. She had experienced firsthand how the palace required you to lower your expectations, to step back from your instincts, to constantly reframe who you were in service of an ancient protocol system that cared nothing for your individuality. She refused to pass that inheritance to her children. While their cousins Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis were tracked by telephoto lenses from the moment they could walk, Louise and James grew up in relative peace. Their family home, Bagshot Park in Surrey, became a kind of sanctuary where two royal children could actually have a childhood. Sleepovers, bike rides, school friendships with kids who had no idea or didn't particularly care who their parents were, regular schools, normal routines, the extraordinary gift of an ordinary life. For years it worked. The British tabloids, so hungry for royal content, largely left Louise and James alone, in part because there were no royal titles to hang a headline on, and in part because Sophie and Edward were ferociously consistent in protecting their children's privacy. They didn't parade them at public events. They didn't use them as props. They simply let them grow up. This stands in such stark contrast to the rest of the royal family that it almost seems like a different dynasty entirely, and in a way Sophie intended it to be. To understand the pressure that was building toward that palace meeting, you have to understand the state of the British monarchy in the years leading up to it. When King Charles ascended to the throne in September 2022, the working royal family had already been dramatically reduced. Prince Harry and Meghan Markle had stepped back in 2020, one of the most seismic events in modern royal history, leaving wounds that have never fully healed. Prince Andrew had been stripped of his military titles and patronages amid a scandal that devastated the institution's credibility. What remained was a dangerously thin roster. Royal biographer Robert Hardman put it bluntly: the working royal family wasn't just slimmed down, it was positively emaciated. Then, in early 2024, the unthinkable happened twice. Both King Charles and Princess Catherine were diagnosed with cancer within weeks of each other, and both had to withdraw from public duties. The slimmed-down monarchy had suddenly become skeletal. The average age of the remaining active royals, excluding Kate and William, rose to 77 years. The palace was facing a genuine constitutional crisis of optics, and increasingly, the eyes of the palace turned toward the next generation. The idea was that Louise and James would begin receiving public funding, take on official engagements on behalf of the crown, and step into the spotlight as the fresh, relatable, down-to-earth young royals the monarchy desperately needed. On paper, it made perfect sense. Louise and James were well-liked, photogenic, and untainted by scandal. There was just one problem. Their mother had spent 20 years building a wall around their ordinary lives, and she was not about to let it come down without a fight. As discussions about the monarchy's future intensified in late 2025 and into 2026, Sophie found herself in an impossible position. She had given 2 decades of loyal, diligent, largely uncelebrated service to the crown, attending hundreds of engagements that never made the front pages, and she had done all of it while simultaneously running the world's most ambitious experiment in royal privacy, raising 2 children who actually had a shot at a real life. Now the institution was asking her to hand those children over. The proposal wasn't presented as a demand. It never is in these circles. It was framed as an opportunity, a privilege, a chance for Louise and James to step into history. But Sophie had sat in enough palace meetings to understand the language beneath the language. She knew what stepping into history actually meant. Schedules dictated by protocol, engagements chosen by committees, lives lived permanently under the microscope of the British press. She had felt it herself. She had openly spoken about the frustration of entering the royal family, how she had had to lower her expectations, step back from her instincts, and completely reframe her identity. She had walked into royal life as a confident, capable professional and had to rebuild herself from the ground up within the constraints of an institution that was centuries old and deeply resistant to individual expression. She had survived it, had even thrived eventually, but it had cost her things she never got back. The thought of watching her children go through the same experience, losing their autonomy piece by piece, their privacy eroded by the relentless machinery of palace life and tabloid scrutiny, was more than she could bear. Sources close to the family say that in the meeting, Sophie made her position clear. The decision about whether Louise and James became working royals had to belong entirely to them, freely made, without pressure, without obligation, without the weight of institutional expectation pressing down on them before they had even had a chance to figure out who they were. But the institutional logic was powerful. The crown needed them. The monarchy's survival in the public imagination arguably depended on fresh faces, and the case being made was not without merit. This was the British monarchy asking for help. The tension in that room, by all accounts, was extraordinary. On one side stood centuries of tradition, duty, obligation, and an institution that genuinely believed in the cause it was making. On the other stood a mother who had nearly lost her daughter at birth, who had sacrificed her own autonomy for decades, and who had promised herself, in the most private chambers of her heart, that her children would never have to do the same unless they chose it freely and joyfully and on their own terms. And it was after one particularly charged exchange, when the institutional needs of the crown were being weighed openly against the personal freedom of two young people who weren't even in the room, that Sophie excused herself. No slammed doors, no dramatic outburst, no tears in the corridor. She simply stood up and left quietly, firmly, with the kind of dignified, unshakable resolution that everyone who knows her says defines her character at its deepest level. In the end, she chose her children, and the palace had no answer for that. Everything we know about Louise and James suggests they are living exactly the life their mother fought to give them. Lady Louise Windsor, now 22, is in her final year studying English literature at the University of St Andrews in Scotland, the same university where Prince William met Catherine Middleton. But unlike her cousin, Louise has navigated university life with remarkable discretion. She is not giving interviews, not attending galas, and has been spotted participating in the St Andrews University Officer Training Corps, appearing in combat fatigues and camouflage paint for military exercises, looking completely at home. Royal commentator Jenny Bond has noted that Louise seems to carry something of her late grandmother Queen Elizabeth II in her spirit, a quiet strength, a sense of service without theatricality. If Louise were to pursue a military career after graduation, she would become the first female royal to serve in the armed forces since Her Majesty herself during World War II, a historic milestone achieved entirely on her own terms. As for James, who turned 18 in December 2025, he has followed his sister's lead in the most telling way possible and declined the royal title that became available to him. Royal author Robert Jobson confirmed that it appeared James would follow Lady Louise's example, just as she had declined to use her HRH title in 2021. A family friend put it even more plainly, saying that being called a prince is the last thing James is interested in. James is currently completing his education at Radley College in Oxfordshire. His university plans remain private, and perhaps that is the point. Both children have, in their own quiet ways, answered the question that the palace was trying to answer for them. They don't want the titles. They don't want the spotlight. They want to live, and they are. Sophie's walk out of that palace meeting was not a moment of weakness. It was not a breakdown or an act of defiance or a scandal in the making. It was a breakthrough. It was the moment when a woman who had spent over 2 decades serving an institution with grace, humility, and extraordinary dedication drew a line in the sand and said, "Not my children, not without their full, free, joyful consent." In doing so, she challenged one of the oldest and most deeply embedded assumptions in the British monarchy, the idea that royal children exist to serve the crown. For centuries, the sons and daughters of kings have been raised as instruments of state, their educations tailored to public duty, their marriages arranged for political advantage, their personal desires treated as secondary to institutional needs. Sophie rejected that model completely, and she did it without burning a single bridge. She didn't give angry interviews. She didn't leak damaging stories to the press. She didn't write a memoir. She didn't go on a podcast and take the palace apart brick by brick. She simply, quietly, and consistently put her children first and let her actions speak louder than any headline ever could. Through all of it, she kept showing up and kept doing the work. She remained the patron of over 70 charities and organizations, from Childline to the London College of Fashion, and continued to be a passionate advocate for women's rights, disability awareness, and the prevention of conflict-related sexual violence around the world. In January 2026, she published a powerful essay in The Telegraph titled "The World is Ignoring the Sudan War," using her platform to draw global attention to a humanitarian crisis that most headlines were passing over. Royal expert Jenny Bond, who has covered the monarchy for decades, put it best. Sophie had been working below the radar for years, neither expecting nor receiving the publicity she deserved, and only in recent years has the public begun to recognize just how essential the Duchess of Edinburgh is, not just to the monarchy's operational survival, but to its soul. And then there was the moment that revealed everything. In a 2025 interview with The Telegraph, Sophie was asked about her children's role in the vigil at Westminster Hall in 2022, when the late Queen Elizabeth II lay in state and the family stood guard. Sophie became visibly emotional. She described it as incredibly moving, said how proud she was of all of them, of Louise and James and all the cousins. And then she paused, placed her hand on her heart, and quietly admitted she couldn't talk about it anymore. That moment, a mother overcome with love and pride for her children, tells you everything you need to know about Sophie's priorities. Not the titles, not the protocol, not the institutional legacy, but the people. The institution is at a crossroads. It has survived scandal, abdication, divorce, and death. It has survived the devastation of the Diana years and the upheaval of Megxit, a Princess of Wales who faced a health scare that gripped the nation. And in the middle of all of that, it is asking itself a fundamental question. What does a modern monarchy look like? Who should carry it forward? And how do you balance the institution's need for visible active royal representation with the very real human cost of asking young people to sacrifice their private lives in service of a centuries-old tradition? Sophie's story forces that question into the open. The monarchy needs people like Sophie, people who are genuinely committed, who show up without fanfare, who care about the causes they champion rather than the cameras following them. Sophie is arguably the most quietly effective working royal of her generation. She has done more good for more people with less recognition than almost any other member of the family, and she has done it while being clear-eyed about the institution's limitations, while protecting her children from its most consuming demands, while maintaining her integrity in a world where integrity is genuinely difficult to maintain. The question now is whether the palace has learned anything from the Sophie precedent, whether it understands that the next generation of royals will be healthiest, happiest, and most effective if they are given a genuine choice about the life they enter, not a theoretical choice dressed up in the language of opportunity, but a real choice with real freedom to say no. Sophie showed that saying no, or at least insisting that the choice belonged to her children and not to an institution, doesn't mean abandoning the crown. It can mean serving it more honestly, more sustainably, in a way that lasts. There is a version of this story that the palace would prefer you to forget. The version where a loyal, dedicated, deeply effective duchess quietly but firmly drew a line that told the institution her children's happiness matters more than your roster needs. It didn't make the front pages at the time. Sophie isn't the kind of woman who courts that sort of attention. But the people in that room knew what it meant. And the ripples of that moment are still moving through the family. For Louise and James, their mother's stand means they get to wake up tomorrow and choose their own lives. That sounds small. In the context of royal history, it is extraordinary.